Today we're looking at the problem of evil, which is the strongest argument against the existence of God. Whereas St. Thomas's fifth way, or the fourth way on the gradations of goodness, is that the world is so good or so full of design that there must be some intelligent and good being who is the source of the goodness of the world. The problem of evil says just the opposite. There's so many bad things in the world that it's impossible that it comes from a good and loving God. We're going to see that there are actually two different problems of evil. The theological problem of evil is the proof for the non-existence of God. It's an argument against the existence of God. It asks, is evil consistent with the existence of a certain type of God? So you would only have a theological problem of evil if you believe in God. Atheists don't have a theological problem of evil. They say the reason there's evil is because the universe is the result of random and different forces, and that the universe doesn't care about human suffering. The existential problem of evil asks the question, can you be happy in the face of the bad things that exist in the world? So even an atheist would have an existential problem of evil. They'd have to find some way of making peace with the fact that the universe contains so much suffering. We'll see when we get to Dostoevsky's arguments how the two arguments are related, or the two different problems of evil are related. The classic statement of the problem of evil comes from David Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion, and he states it as an inconsistency between our beliefs about God and our beliefs about the world. On the one hand, we believe that God is all-knowing or omniscient. That means of all the different possible ways of making the world, God knows them. He knows what's best, and he knows the effects of making the world one way or another. He's also conceived of as being all-powerful or omnipotent, which means God could make the world any way that he wants to. And he's also conceived of as being completely good or benevolent, which means that it's part of God's nature to always do the best possible thing. So if there's anything wrong with the world, it can't be because God couldn't fix it. He's omnipotent. It couldn't be because God didn't know about it, or didn't know a way to fix it, or didn't know a better way, because he's all-knowing. And it's not because God wouldn't fix it, because he's completely good. So if that's the case, and he's the creator of this world, as St. Thomas's argument suggests, then this world should be the best of all possible worlds. He can make it any way he wants. He knows all the different possible ways and which one is the best. He only does the best possible thing because he's completely good. So this should be the best possible world. But it seems obvious when we look at the world, there's all kinds of things that we think could be fixed about the world. And we'll see that this is broken up into two different types of evil. Here we're using the word evil just as in the sense of imperfections about the world, any way that the world could be better. Sometimes people use the word evil, to talk about an evil villain or something, to talk about things that bad people do on purpose because they're bad. But now we're just using the word evil to mean imperfect, an imperfection in the world. And there are two different types of imperfections or bad things in the world. One is natural evil, which isn't due to human action. Sometimes we even call these acts of God, like hurricanes or earthquakes or a meteor strike or something like that. And then there's moral evil, which is due to human action. That would be war, murder, the Holocaust. Those would be examples of moral evil. And we'll see why the evils are split up into those two different types when we look at the Christian solution to the problem of evil. So the atheist merely denies the existence of God, whereas a believer is going to have to deny in some way the existence of evil. Sometimes the problem of evil is stated as a dilemma, that there are two sets of facts which both can't be true, and you have to choose one or the other. The atheist rules out God, and those who believe in God are going to have to suggest that this really is the best possible world in some way. The first thing we want to look at are a couple of bad ways of getting out of the problem of evil. Traditionally, many thinkers have tried to mess around with the definition of God in order to explain where evil comes from. You may remember that St. Augustine started out thinking about the problem of evil. When you read his On Free Choice of the Will, he was talking about why there's evil in the world. And St. Augustine had started out in his youth being a Manichaean. You may remember that Manichaeanism believes that there are two equally powerful forces in the universe, a good force, God, and a bad force, the devil, or some evil force. And they're duking it out for control of the universe, and the evil is either due to the evil force or as a side effect of the great war between those two different forces. Of course, you can see what's wrong with that view of God and why it was declared a heresy. If that's the case, then God wouldn't be all-powerful. Even in Christianity, that believes in the devil, believes that if God wanted to, he could eradicate the devil and all of the effects of his actions with a click of his fingers. And if he allows him to continue to exist, it's because it serves some purpose in the great plan. A similar view is called deism. Manichaeanism is an ancient view arising in the ancient world in the 2nd to 4th centuries, whereas deism is an Enlightenment view. It's based upon the idea of science, that the scientific laws of nature run reality, that God set up the world like a great machine, and that it lets it run according to the laws of nature, that he's sort of like an absentee landlord. And if evil happens, it's because God doesn't want to interfere with the machine, or he just left it running and doesn't really care about the effects that it has on human beings. And again, that makes it either so that God isn't all-powerful, he can't stop the machine, he's not all-knowing, he doesn't know how to run the machine, or he didn't know what effects it would have when he let it run, or most likely, he just doesn't care, he's not completely good. We'll see that those two views, along with other views, that try to mess with the definition of God, create a God who's no longer an adequate object of worship. So you wouldn't want to worship someone who is just bigger and stronger and smarter than you. It should be obvious why that is. If the purpose of a God is to make sense of it all and to explain why there's evil and what happens after death, if you had something that claimed to be God that didn't know the answers to those questions, didn't have power over life and death, then it would need a God too. It would be just as clueless and just as befuddled by the problem of existence as we are. On the next slide, you'll see the music video of Joan Osborne's song, "What If God Was One of Us?" Just a stranger on the bus trying to make its way home. If God were merely a more power alien being who maybe engineered us or something, then that God would need a God. It wouldn't solve the problems of existence. So there's no point in believing in a bigger, more powerful being that doesn't solve the basic problems that the God concept is made to solve. So let's talk a little bit more about what it means to say that something is the best possible world before we look at the Christian solution, which is going to say that this really is the best possible world, and that it's consistent with the existence of a God. We'll have to get clear about a few problems about what it means to say something is the best possible world. The first thing we should point out is that just because an alternative has evil or bad things in it doesn't mean it's not the best alternative. Consider two different ways of studying for an exam, say A and B. A has absolutely no evil, no effort, no problems involved. Maybe it's the method of just sleeping with the book underneath your pillow, or playing all of these voice threads on your tape recorder or your MP3 player at night while you sleep. But it might have a fairly limited payoff in your grade. Note that there might be another method that considers all kinds of evil. Maybe you would take notes 5 times and copy them over in triplicate and memorize every single word in the readings and every single word from every one of the lectures, and study 10 hours a day. But it might come out with a very large payoff, So it's obvious that even though this alternative has evil, it's still better than this alternative. So just because there's evil in an alternative doesn't mean it's not the best alternative. You have to consider how much good comes from that evil. Now, we don't know yet whether this is the best possible way of studying. You would have to try other alternatives, maybe that had less evil, and then see if they came up with the same payoff, and see if overall the payoff, considering evils and goods, was greater than this one. So imagine another case where you kept trying to reduce the amount of evil until you got to like half of the evil or half of the suffering. And if you still got the same payoff, then this would obviously be better than this alternative. So how do we know when we've got to the best possible way or the best possible alternative? Well, that would be when we try to reduce the amount of evil. If there's this much studying and this much work, if we try to reduce some of that studying and work, all of a sudden the payoff plummets and it becomes a worse alternative. That means that all 20 units of pain or suffering in this case, all 20 units of that evil were really necessary. You couldn't get rid of any of them without reducing the payoff. That's what necessary means. So the Christian solution is going to have to say, first of all, that all of the bad things that happen in this world are really necessary, that you couldn't remove any of them from the world without making it worse overall, just as in this case we couldn't remove any of the evil without making it worse overall. But that raises a question, what is necessary for God? You can see in our case, it's sometimes complex to ask when things are necessary. What would be necessary if you had to get to Boston? Well, you might think, well, I need to take a car, or maybe you don't have a car. It would be necessary for you to get a bus, or to call an Uber or something. But of course, that's only necessary if you don't have a personal helicopter. And a helicopter would only be necessary if you can't teleport instantaneously to Boston. God wouldn't need a car or an Uber to get to Boston. He could just click his fingers and instantaneously appear in Boston. So what's necessary for you depends upon what your abilities are and what defects or needs you happen to have. And this was a problem because, remember, God is supposed to be all-powerful. He can do anything, and he's all-knowing. He knows all the ways of doing things. So in the Middle Ages, theologians pondered this problem and asked questions like, can God make a rock so big that even he can't lift it? And you can see what the puzzle is here, right? If God can make a rock so big that he can't lift it, then he's not a very good rock lifter. And if he can't make a rock so big that he can't lift it, then he's not a very good rock maker. And the theologians finally reconciled themselves to this puzzle by saying that God can't do it because the very idea is a logical contradiction, that even an all-powerful being would be limited by the laws of logic. Even God, an all-powerful being, couldn't make 2 + 2 = 4, couldn't make a square circle. Even God, if he wants to find the shortest distance between 2 points, is going to have to take a straight line. So, since it's a contradiction to make a rock so big that even you can't lift it, it was thought that the fact that God can't do that doesn't mean that God isn't all-powerful. So, there are 2 different types of necessity that you might think of, and we have to be careful in thinking about explanations of evil that we're doing the right one. One type of evil, one type of necessity, like the necessity of what you need to get to Boston, is called contingent necessity. And you should recognize that that's an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp, because contingent and necessity mean the opposite of each other. Necessary means you have to have it. Contingency means it depends upon something else. So this would be fake necessity. It's only necessary contingent upon some weakness or some mistake. It's only necessary for me to drive to Boston if I don't have a helicopter. It's only necessary for me to take a helicopter if I'm not able to teleport there instantly. So contingent necessity is when something is necessary only based upon some previous weakness or previous mistake. Hume's famous example from the Dialogues on Natural Religion is to imagine that you hired an architect to make you a house. And when you went to inspect the house, it looked like this. And you pointed out that it's falling down and everything's all crooked. And the architect pointed out that no, this is really the best possible house, because if you tried to fix any of these things, the windows or the turret or the doors, that the entire house would fall down. So it meets our criteria of not being able to take away any of the evil without also destroying all of the good. In this case, you wouldn't be convinced that this was the best possible house. You would say, well, you should have made the house right in the first place. So this evil is only evil contingent upon the mistake, contingent upon not doing it right in the first place. Whereas real necessity or logical necessity would be really necessary even for an all-powerful being. It's only limited by the laws of logic. So the Christian solution is going to have to say not only that every bad thing is really necessary, and that if you changed any of it, it would reduce some of the good. They're going to have to say it would be even logically necessary, that is, really even necessary for an all-powerful being. And that's a little bit tricky. So let me give you two examples of bad explanations of evil that are contingent or fake necessity. Sometimes you'll hear people say that God had to allow death and illness in the world because otherwise, if people didn't eventually die, that eventually the world would become so overcrowded there'd be even more hunger and death and suffering. So God makes death and illness so that the world doesn't get overcrowded. Can you see what's wrong with that explanation? That assumes that God made the mistake of not making the world big enough in the first place, or that he didn't know ahead of time how much space he'd need. And if he's all powerful, he can just go poof, here's more room, here's more food, here's another world. So this is a bad explanation of evil. It assumes, like Manichaeanism, that God isn't all powerful or all knowing. Consider another explanation that you often hear. This one's a little more tricky because it's in some ways close to, it's a slight misunderstanding of the actual Christian solution to the problem of evil. So they'll often say when there's a flood or a natural disaster, they'll say there's always some good that comes out of it. That here these people are exercising their charity and people pull together and send care packages. And all of this good comes from the suffering by giving us an opportunity to alleviate that suffering. Of course, just the fact that some good comes from the evil doesn't mean it's the best possible world. Remember, we had to ask, could we reduce that evil and still get that good? So if 100,000 people died, could we still get that good if only 99,000 people died, or if only 99,999 people died? And of course, that would be an important question to one mother who saw her little child get swept away by the flood and saw his little face in fear and shock being dragged underneath the water and seeing him for the last time. She would have little consolation if you told her that other people got to exercise their charity by helping the people that were left, and that compensated for the death of her child. So you always have to ask, is it possible to get whatever good comes out of it with less evil? In the best possible world, every single evil would have to be necessary. And of course, every single mother, every single person that suffers can ask, why me? Why did this? Why was it necessary that this happened to just me? So let's look at the traditional Christian solution and see how Christianity had traditionally attempted to explain why all of the bad things in the world are logically necessary, even for an all-powerful being, and that this really is the best of all possible worlds. So the solution has two different stages by splitting the types of evil into natural evil and moral evil. And that's why we split the evils in the world into those two different categories. So natural evil is seen as arising from moral evil. And this is sometimes called the doctrine of original sin. In the story of Adam and Eve, there was no natural evil in the Garden of Eden. There was no death. There was no suffering. Even the lions were vegetarians, so they didn't have to cause suffering to the lambs. And evil and death and illness came into existence through the fall, through Adam and Eve disobeying and eating the apple. And whether you believe that story is literally true or just a metaphor, the idea is that human beings have some defect in their nature that is they inherit along with their nature. So original sin is not that people are punished for the sins of their ancestors. We all see that would be an unjust God who punished you for the sins of Adam and Eve or your grandfathers or your parents or people that you haven't even seen. Instead, the idea is that there's a defect in human nature that we all inherit along with our human nature, and that even if you were an all-powerful being, it would be impossible for God to make you happy, to put you in heaven right away, without going through some evil, without going through some suffering. So we considered this a little bit earlier. Remember, we gave you godlike powers. We let you pretend you were God. And we asked, could you create a heaven for yourself in which you could be perfectly happy without eventually it becoming so boring and tedious that you wished you could go out of existence? And if you said no, then you understand sort of what original sin is. That even an all-powerful God couldn't have put us in heaven right away. It was necessary for us to suffer some evil and overcome that evil using our free will in order to finally make us capable of the highest possible type of happiness, to probably finally make us capable of having a type of heaven. So in some way or other, all of the natural evil that arises is somehow necessary to perfect ourselves and to allow us to finally reach that state where we are capable of having perfect happiness. We sort of recognize this in our own children, right? That if you tried to never make your child do anything, never overcome any struggles, never overcome any evil, you wouldn't make a perfectly happy child. You can't sort of make your child have a happy life all by yourself, by just your actions. It's necessary that the child develop a good character and virtues, and that they are capable of sort of organizing and creating their own life. So in the same way, the doctrine of original sin says even an all-powerful being who wanted to make us happy couldn't have made us happy right off the bat, since our happiness in some way depends upon our own actions and using free will to overcome obstacles. The second stage, since then natural evil comes from moral evil, comes from the fact that we have this defect that wouldn't allow us to be happy at all, even if God put us in heaven right off the bat. Then the question is, why did God give us that defect? Why did God give us free will? And the idea here is what we've seen before, that free will is this ability to organize our experience and to transform evil into good, and to create new types of value from organizing it into a larger whole. So there are new types of happiness, new types of value that come into existence through free will, love and friendship and beauty and art. And if we didn't have free will, we would be like an animal just following instincts. We would be just like a robot. And even though we wouldn't suffer and we wouldn't kill, we'd also be incapable of these higher types of value. So the Christian view is going to be that it's through free will that we're capable of creating new types of values that we couldn't even imagine for lower types of creatures. And that the heaven that we get by exercising our free will and overcoming evil is so great, the value is so good, that it counterbalances all of the evil that came into existence through it. That we're much, much better off having evil and suffering and having free will than we would be if we were just like an animal or a robot and we never had to suffer pain or death. So that's the traditional Christian solution, that somehow or other, through our free will, we're only capable of the best possible world of heaven by experiencing evil and overcoming it. And that somehow or another, there is a providence or a plan so that every evil that we encounter is really logically necessary. Unless it happened to us, we wouldn't be able to be perfectly happy. We wouldn't be able to construct the best, to experience the best possible world. So you can watch this little video, which is an introduction to the free will solution and the problem of evil. So sometimes this view is called perfectionism, that human beings have to suffer through evil in order to perfect their nature, in order to reach the perfect happiness of heaven, and that God has constructed a plan from all eternity to allow us to encounter precisely those evils that we need to overcome to perfect ourselves and make us capable of happiness. So you can see just how difficult this solution is to maintain. David Hume gives examples of 4 types of evils that he thinks we can't see how they're necessary. But we don't need David Hume. It's easier for us to think of terrible natural disasters or evils like the COVID-19 pandemic that seem to produce evils that don't make us better, at least in ways that we can understand. And you should note that not only is it hard to explain large evils, but small ones are just as hard to explain, since every single bad thing that happens is logically necessary for the universe to be the best possible thing. So if you woke up the morning of your senior prom or your wedding with a giant zit in the middle of your forehead, you'd have to ask yourself, why was that necessary? If a car drives by you at just the right moment and splashes, dirty, muddy water all over you when you're on your way to the job interview, you have to ask yourself, why is that logically necessary for the best possible world? So it seems like there's lots of cases where there are evils that human beings cannot understand any necessity for. So the answer to this question is based upon the book of Job and the idea of a providence that goes beyond human understanding. You may remember the story of Job, that God and the devil were talking, and they are talking about Job, and the devil says, of course Job is a good person now and follows you and is obedient to you. Look at all the good blessings that you've given him. He's happy and content. If you took away all those things, then he would curse you and no longer be obedient and faithful to you. And God says, I'll take that bet. And the idea here is not that you're supposed to literally believe that evil happens in the world because God is playing dice with our worlds or making bets on us. I think the idea or the significance is supposed to be that sometimes it can feel like that. Sometimes there can be such bad things that happen that it seems like somebody is out to get you or that the world doesn't care about you. That's going to be the point, is that there are sometimes evils that don't feel like providence, that we can't understand in any reasonable way, are meant to help us and are necessary for the best possible world. So Job finally calls aloud to God. He says, I search for you back and forth. If I could find you, I would fill my mouth with arguments and ask you, why has all this happened to me? And alone of all men who have cried aloud to God, God actually answers Job in the form of a voice in the whirlwind. And this is what God says to Job in the whirlwind. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Have you entered into the mystery of snow? Can you bind the influences of the constellations? Can you tame the wild leviathan or beast and take it home as a pet for your children? Basically, God is saying, who are you, you little pipsqueak, to question me? Your intellect is incapable of understanding the bigger plan and the bigger picture of why all this evil is necessary. And Job responds by saying, before I'd only heard of you by the ear, now I've seen you with my own eye. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent. So the idea is that we have to have faith because God's plan, or the way in which it's necessary for the best possible world, is beyond human comprehension. and that maybe we'll only finally understand it when we reach that highest possible happiness in heaven, but that we're incapable of understanding it through human reason now, and that we have to believe it through faith. This is going to be the point at which Dostoevsky's arguments will start in the next lecture. But let me just summarize sort of the basic structure of the debate. So far, we've gone through these three stages. We started with the Christian solution, which was an answer to the problem of evil, that dilemma of how can God be all-powerful and all-knowing and completely good if there's evil in the world. We saw how traditional Christianity explained that through perfectionism and the existence of some defect in human nature that arises from free will, which at the same time makes possible the best possible world. We saw that you could object to that by trying to point out evils that didn't seem to be necessary. And then we've seen how the traditional Christian view can respond by saying that God's plan or providence is beyond human comprehension. We'll see Dostoevsky's arguments against that next time. The arguments we're going to be looking at next time are not actually Dostoevsky's. Dostoevsky is a Christian existentialist, like Kierkegaard. He's going to believe that it's possible to overcome evil through an act of will. The objections, the three arguments we'll look at next time, are actually from Dostoevsky's character Ivan, and he answers those objections in the rest of the book, The Brothers Karamazov. So that's where we'll start next time.